Have you ever stopped to think about what a simple wooden cross can mean? For many, it is just a religious symbol hanging on the wall. For others, an adornment on a chain around the neck. But for Antonio Silva, that rustic cross, made of dark wood and worn by time, represented the turning point in a life marked by wrong choices and tortuous paths. I will tell you a story that began in a small chapel by the roadside, where a desperate man found, in the roughness of an ancient cross, the beginning of his redemption. A story about pain, sacrifice, and a love so deep that it is capable of transforming even the most hardened heart. Join me on this journey inspired by the hymn Rude Cruise, a narrative about how the simplest symbol can carry the deepest meaning when we understand the true sacrifice it represents. Antonio Silva was 42 years old when his life completely collapsed. A successful executive at a large company in São Paulo, he had built his career with unwavering determination, climbing each rung of the corporate ladder with a single goal: success at any cost. His office on the 28th floor of a mirrored skyscraper on Avenida Paulista offered a panoramic view of the city. There, seated in his Italian leather chair, he commanded a team of 50 people with an iron fist. "Results are what matters," he repeated like a mantra to his subordinates, while demanding overtime, work on weekends, and a dedication that bordered on fanaticism. At home, the story was no different. Married for 15 years to Helena, Antonio was rarely present. Family dinners had become rare events. The 10th birthday of his son, Miguel, was celebrated without the presence of his father, who was closing an important deal abroad. The wife's complaints were met with irritation and phrases such as, "I'm doing this for you," or "You have everything you need. What are you complaining about?" The truth is that Antonio had become a slave to his own ambition. The gold watch on his wrist, the imported car in the garage, and the robust bank account were his true gods. For him, professional success was the only measure of personal worth. It was on a rainy Thursday in March that everything changed. When she got home early, something extraordinarily rare, she found the house empty and a letter on the living room table. Helena had left, taking Miguel with her. "We can no longer live as ghosts in your life," the letter read in trembling handwriting, stained with tears. That same night, the phone rang. On the other end of the line, a deep voice informed that his mother, Dona Conceição, had suffered a stroke and was hospitalized in serious condition in the interior of Minas Gerais. The woman who had raised him alone, who had washed clothes outside to pay for his studies, who had always believed in him, was dying, and Anthony barely remembered the last time he had visited her. In less than 24 hours, the man who believed he had it all had lost what really mattered. Sitting on the floor of the empty room, with the crumpled letter in one hand and a glass of whiskey in the other, Antonio faced for the first time the emptiness he had created around himself. The next morning, after a sleepless night, he threw some clothes in a suitcase, got into his car, and left for Minas Gerais. Not to save her mother, the doctors had called again to report that she had not survived, but to bury her, and unknowingly to begin a journey that would change her life forever. The trip from São Paulo to the small town in Minas Gerais, where his mother had lived her last years, was like a dive into long repressed memories. Every mile traveled seemed to take Antonio deeper into himself, to a place he had avoided visiting for decades. The rain fell incessantly, turning the road into a dangerous and slippery path. The windshield wiper could barely handle the water that accumulated on the glass. It was as if the sky cried for the loss of Dona Conceição, while her son followed in silence, with his heart as heavy as the clouds carried above. When the GPS indicated that there were only 50 kilometers to reach his destination, the car's tire burst. Antonio, used to having everything under control, realized that he did not know how to change a tire. I had always had drivers or assistance services to solve this type of problem. There, on that deserted road in the pouring rain, he was just a helpless man. After several unsuccessful attempts to get a signal on his cell phone, he saw a small building on the side of the road. It was a simple chapel, made of stone and wood, which seemed to have been erected centuries ago. Without many options, he ran there in search of shelter. The interior of the chapel was empty and silent. A few candles flickered on the altar, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. And there, in the center of the altar, was it, a cross of dark wood, rustic, without adornments or decorations. Just two wooden planks joined together, marked by time and history. Anthony sat on the last bench, soaked and exhausted. He was not a religious man. He had not set foot in a church in years, but something about that simple cross captured his attention in a way he couldn't explain. As he watched that rough and unrefined symbol, he remembered his childhood, when his mother took him to Mass every Sunday. He remembered the stories she told about Jesus, about sacrifice and unconditional love, stories he had dismissed as naive fantasies when he grew up and discovered that the world valued power and money more than kindness and compassion. What kind of man have I become? He whispered to himself, as tears, mixed with the rainwater that still flowed from his face, fell silently. It was at this moment that the door of the chapel opened, and an elderly gentleman, wearing a faded rain poncho, entered. His face was marked by deep wrinkles, like furrows in a field plowed by life, but his eyes shone with a peace that Anthony could not understand. "Has the storm brought you here, son?" asked the old man, sitting next to Antonio. "My tire blew out," he replied dryly, uncomfortable with the proximity of that stranger. "Sometimes we need to stop along the way to find our true direction," the elderly man said, looking at the cross on the altar. "That cross over there. Do you know what she teaches me every day?" Antonio didn't answer, but something inside him wanted to hear. "She teaches me that the most valuable things in life rarely come in pretty packages. That cross is rude, simple, without material value. But it represents the greatest act of love this world has ever seen." The old man's words reverberated within Antonio as if they had been spoken by his own conscience. He looked again at the cross and, for the first time, saw beyond the worn wood. He saw sacrifice. He saw surrender. He saw a love that he had never understood or allowed in his own life. Dona Conceção's funeral was held in a small church in the city, under a sky that had finally cleared. Antonio, dressed in his expensive suit, seemed out of place among the simple residents who came to pay their last respects to the woman everyone knew as the seamstress with blessed hands. To his surprise, the church was packed. People of all ages, from children to the elderly leaning on canes, filled the wooden benches. Each of them seemed to have a story to tell about Dona Conceção, how she had made her wedding dress free of charge to the young orphan who was getting married, how she mended the clothes of the children of the local orphanage for free, how she always had a word of comfort and a cup of coffee for anyone who knocked on her door. Antonio heard these stories with a lump in his throat. Who was this woman of whom everyone spoke so fondly? How could he be the same person he had relegated to quick birthday calls and hurried visits every 2 or 3 years? After the ceremony, an elderly lady approached him. "Are you really Conceção's son? She talked so much about you." He showed everyone the reports about his business. "I was so proud when you appeared in that important magazine." Anthony felt as if a dagger had been plunged into his chest. While he barely found time to call his mother, she collected every bit of information about him, proudly sharing his accomplishments with everyone she knew. Upon returning to the simple house where her mother had lived her last years, the feeling of guilt only intensified. It was a small, 2-bedroom house with antique and well-kept furniture. In the living room, a bookshelf displayed, in a prominent place, all the photos of Antonio that she had, from his graduation from school to newspaper clippings about his promotions in the company. In Dona Conceção's room on the nightstand, she found a Bible worn out by constant use. Inside it, a bookmark indicated the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verse 13. "Greater love has no one than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." On the wall opposite, the bed hung a wooden cross, similar to the one he had seen in the chapel on the road. Rustic, simple yet powerful in its meaning. Below her, a small embroidered sign read, "Rude cross has been erected. Blood has gushed out of her." Sitting on the simple bed where his mother had spent her last nights, Antonio finally allowed the pain he had been repressing to explode into uncontrolled sobs. He cried for the time lost, for the visits he never made, for the calls he never completed. He wept for the woman who had given everything for him and received so little in return. Between tears, his eyes rested on a yellowed envelope in the half-open drawer of the nightstand. Her name was written on the front, in her mother's trembling handwriting. With hesitant hands, he took the envelope and opened it. The letter was dated 3 months ago. Apparently, Dona Concepcion knew that her time was running out and wanted to leave her last words to her son. Antonio began to read, his heart racing. "My dear son Antonio, if you are reading this letter, it is because God has already called me to him. Don't be sad, my son. I had a blessed life, and my greatest gift was having you as a son. I know that our relationship has not been as I dreamed in recent years. The distance, their occupations, my stubbornness in not wanting to bother, all this has created a chasm between us that I deeply regret. But I want you to know that I have never, not for a second, stopped loving you with all my heart. Remember when you were little and you asked me why your father had abandoned us? I told him that some people can't carry their crosses, so they run away from them. You, at just 6 years old, told me that you would never run away from your responsibilities. And I know you didn't run away, my son. You've worked hard. You've earned your place in the world. You've built a respectable career. But I fear that at some point along the way, you have forgotten the most important lesson I have tried to teach you. The cross we carry should not be a burden that crushes us, but a symbol of the love we give. Here on my wall, I have a wooden cross that your grandfather made with his own hands. It is rustic, imperfect, but for me it is the most precious symbol I possess. She reminds me daily that true value is not in the shiny and expensive things, but in the sacrifice made for love. My son, I don't know how your life is now. I hope you're happy, that Helena and little Miguel are well. But if, by chance, you have lost your way, forgotten what really matters, I ask you to look at this crude cross and remember, the greatest treasure we can have is not things, but people. They are not achievements, but shared moments. I leave you this cross, not as an object of material value, but as a reminder that true love always involves sacrifice, and that no professional success can replace the love of a family. Go in peace, my son. Be happy. And always remember that wherever I am, I will be watching over you, proud of the man you have become, but hoping that you will find the balance that will make your heart truly full. With all my love, your mother, Concepcion. Anthony let the letter fall on his lap, unable to hold back the tears that were now flowing freely. Her mother's words were like a mirror that reflected all the distortion her life had become. He had conquered everything the world considered valuable, but he had lost what really mattered. He looked again at the rustic cross on the wall, a simple cross without adornments or material value, but loaded with meaning. A cross that spoke of sacrifice, of surrender, of a love greater than he had ever understood. At that moment, alone in his late mother's room, Antonio made a decision. It needed to change. He needed to reconnect with what really mattered. He needed to find Helena and Miguel, ask for forgiveness, rebuild the bonds he had neglected for so long. And most of all, he needed to learn the true meaning of that rugged cross. In the days following the funeral, Antonio remained in the small town of Minas Gerais. He stayed in the house that had been his mother's, sleeping in the guest room that she had always kept tidy, waiting for visits that rarely happened. During this time, he began to truly know who Dona Concepcion had been. She visited the church where she attended Sunday masses and prayer groups on Wednesdays. She talked to the women in the sewing group who met to make clothes for needy children. She heard stories from local merchants who told how she always set aside a portion of her modest salary to help families in difficulty. Her mother didn't have much, but the little she had she shared with everyone, said the local priest, a middle-aged man with gentle eyes. She lived the true meaning of the cross, love through sacrifice. Each new discovery about his mother's life was like a stone in Antonio's stomach. How could he be so blind? How could he trade true wealth, the wealth of meaningful relationships, of a purposeful life, for numbers in a bank account and a pompous position? One afternoon, while organizing Dona Concecion's belongings, she found an old photo album. In the first few pages, he saw images of himself as a child, smiling, carefree, with his eyes shining with joy. In one particularly touching photo, he, aged about 7, hugged his mother tightly, both laughing for the camera. Behind the photo, a note with his mother's handwriting, "My greatest wealth." Leafing through the album further, Antonio saw the record of his own transformation. The smiling boy gave way to a serious teenager, then to a determined-looking young adult, and finally, to the far-looking executive he had become. It was like watching his own estrangement, not only from his mother, but from himself, from who he really was. On the last page of the album, he found a recent photo, him, Helena, and Miguel, on a rare vacation moment 3 years ago. In the image, his wife and son smiled while he looked at his cell phone, clearly absorbed in some work matter. The caption, written by his mother, read, "May God help my son to see the true blessing before him." That photo was the last straw. Antonio took out his cell phone and with trembling fingers dialed Helena's number. After 3 rings, he heard the voice he loved so much, but had neglected for so long. "Helena, it's me, Antonio. We need to talk." The trip back to Sao Paulo was very different from the one going. The sky, once laden with dark clouds and torrential rain, now displayed a crystalline blue, with the afternoon sun painting the landscape in golden hues. Anthony drove in silence, his mother's wooden cross neatly wrapped in a silk handkerchief on the passenger seat, as if carrying a holy relic. The road wound through mountains and valleys, revealing panoramas he had never noticed on the outward journey. It was as if his eyes were truly open for the first time, seeing not only the physical landscape but also the contours of his own soul. How could I live so long on autopilot? He wondered aloud, breaking the silence that filled the car. The question echoed unanswered, but he knew the truth. He had become a prisoner of a distorted view of success, a man so obsessed with fate that he had completely forgotten to appreciate the journey. As he passed the small chapel where he had found shelter during the storm, Anthony slowed down. For a moment, he considered stopping again, thanking the old man who had shared those words of wisdom. But the place seemed deserted, as if this encounter had been just a dream, or perhaps something more, a divine intervention in a time of deep need. "Thank you," he whispered, glancing briefly at the modest building as he passed, taking with him the lesson he had learned there. As he approached Sao Paulo, anxiety began to grow in his chest. What would it be like to face Helena after months of separation? How would he explain his transformation without it seeming like just another empty promise, like so many others he had made over the years? "This time is different," he said to himself, squeezing the steering wheel tightly. "This time it's not just words." When he finally caught sight of the skyline that defined Latin America's largest metropolis, Antonio felt a mixture of familiarity and strangeness. This was his city, the scene of his professional achievements, but now it felt like a foreign place, imposing, cold, driven by a frenetic energy he no longer shared. His first impulse was to drive directly to the luxurious apartment he had shared with Helena and Miguel in the Morumbi neighborhood. But I knew they wouldn't be there. Helena had mentioned that she was living with her parents in Campinas. In addition, he needed time to organize his thoughts, to carefully plan how he would approach this reconciliation. He chose to go to the empty apartment, to face the space he had once called home, and that now seemed just a soulless casing, filled with expensive objects but devoid of true value. When he opened the door, he was greeted by the oppressive silence and the faintly musty smell of a place long closed. He deposited his suitcase in the entrance hall and walked slowly through the rooms, observing every detail as if he saw them for the first time. In the living room, the Italian leather sofa that had cost a fortune seemed cold and impersonal. The artwork on the walls, bought not for aesthetic appreciation, but as investments recommended by a consultant, now seemed pretentious and empty. On the shelf, some framed photos captured moments that should have been precious. Miguel's birth, family vacations, celebrations, but Antonio realized with regret that in almost all of them, his smile did not reach the eyes. He was physically present, but his mind was always elsewhere, planning the next conquest, the next acquisition. In Miguel's room, the expensive and practically untouched toys told the story of a father who tried to make up for his absence with material gifts, an imported electric train still in the box, a professional telescope never assembled, state-of-the-art video games, all futile attempts to fill the void left by lack of time and attention with objects. What kind of father buys a telescope for his son and never finds a night to stargaze with him? He murmured, feeling the weight of guilt on his shoulders. In the main closet, Helena's clothes were still there, neatly organized. Elegant dresses, well-cut suits, designer shoes lined by color. She had taken only the essentials, leaving behind the symbols of a life she no longer wanted. Antonio picked up one of her favorite dresses, a navy blue model she had worn for her 40th birthday. He brought it close to his face and took a deep breath, seeking to capture her scent, but found only the neutral smell of a long, untouched fabric. Even this sensory memory had been denied to him. She sat on the edge of the bed they once shared, holding the dress in her lap, and finally allowed the tears to flow freely. He cried for the time lost, for the opportunities wasted, for the moments that would never return. He wept for his wife who had grown tired of waiting for a truly present husband, for his son who had grown up believing that his father's work was more important than him, for his mother who had left without him being able to express his gratitude adequately. When he finally recovered, it was already night. She got up, carefully put the dress back in the closet, and walked to the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator out of habit, finding it practically empty, except for a few bottles of mineral water and condiments. He closed it without interest, realizing that he did not feel hungry, only a void that no food could fill. He went to his home office, a room that Helena used to call the Dragon's Cave, because it was the place where he isolated himself for hours on end, even when he was physically at home. There, the massive mahogany desk was covered in a thin layer of dust, except for a neat rectangle where his laptop normally stood. On an impulse, Antonio turned on the computer that was still there, an older model that he used as a backup. The screen lit up, revealing as wallpaper a photo of Helena and Miguel on a beach, smiling, with the sunset in the background. He wasn't in the picture, probably because he was the one who had taken the photo, in a rare moment of attending a family event. He opened his email inbox, finding hundreds of unread messages, most related to work, some social media notifications, offers from online stores. Nothing really important, nothing that justified the priority he had always given to these communications, to the detriment of the people he loved. Among the messages, one captured her attention, an email from Helena, sent 3 days after her departure, with the subject line, "Why we got to this point." Anthony hesitated, the cursor hovering over the message. Part of him feared what he would find there, the painful truths that Helena had probably expressed in a moment of deep sorrow. But he knew he needed to face it, as part of his redemption process. He clicked on the message and began to read. "Antonio, I write this message after 3 sleepless nights, trying to understand how we got to this point. How 2 young people who loved each other deeply ended up becoming strangers who share the same roof. How the gentle, dreamy man I married turned into someone for whom the numbers on a spreadsheet are more important than the heartbeat of his son. I'm not writing to accuse him or to open old wounds. I'm writing because, in spite of everything, I still care about you enough to wish you understood why I had to leave. Over the past few years, I've watched you gradually disappear, replaced by a version of yourself obsessed with success and recognition. Every promotion, every bonus, every new car or expensive watch seemed to take him a little further away from us. And the saddest thing is that you didn't even notice. Remember Miguel's ballet performance last year? He practiced for weeks, determined to impress him. You promised to be there, but you called 20 minutes before saying that an emergency had arisen at work. I saw his eyes looking for you in the audience throughout the performance. When he finished, he didn't want the ice cream I promised as a celebration. He just asked, "Why does Daddy never have time for me?" Or our 15-year wedding anniversary when I booked that restaurant you loved so much, only to receive a message from you saying you were stuck on a video conference with clients from Japan. I had dinner alone that night, explaining to the embarrassed waiter that my husband was too busy being important. It wasn't the big moments that destroyed our marriage, Antonio. There were the 1,000 small absences, the broken promises, the postponed conversations, the distorted priorities. It was waking up every day next to someone who was physically present but emotionally somewhere else. I have tried to talk to you countless times. I suggested couple therapy. I begged for more time together, but you always had the same answer. After I close this deal, after this phase passes, I'm doing this for you, as if we had asked for all those material things that you exchanged for your presence in our lives. Your mom called me last week. She's worried about you, you know. He said that you barely visit her, that her calls are always rushed. She asked me not to give up on you, said that you are a good man who just lost his way. Maybe she's right. Perhaps the Antonio I knew and loved is still there, somewhere, buried under layers of ambition and professional success. But I can't wait any longer for you to find your way back. Miguel is growing, and I need to show him that healthy relationships require reciprocity, presence, real commitment, not just financial support and expensive gifts on holidays. I'm not closing the door completely, Antonio. If one day you really understand what I'm saying, if you realize what really matters in life, maybe we can talk again. Not as husband and wife, at least not immediately, but as two people who once loved each other deeply and who can perhaps find a new path together. Until then, I sincerely wish you to find peace and clarity, that you realize before it's too late that no professional achievement can warm your heart on cold nights, that no salary bonus can replace your child's hug, that no applause from coworkers sounds as sweet as the "I love you" whispered by someone who truly cares about you. With affection still, Helena. When he finished reading, Antonio was again in tears. Every word was a painful truth, a merciless mirror that reflected the empty man he had become. But there was also a spark of hope in that message. Helena had not completely closed the door. He had left a crack, a possibility of redemption. "I won't waste this chance," he promised aloud, as if taking a solemn oath in the silence of that apartment that no longer felt like home. That night, he slept on the sofa in the living room, unable to lie down in the bed he had once shared with Helena. Before falling asleep, he placed his mother's wooden cross on the coffee table, where he could see her when he woke up, a constant reminder of the new path he was determined to follow. The next morning, she woke up with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. He knew exactly what he needed to do. It was not just about winning back Helena and Miguel, but about rediscovering himself, finding again the man who had lost himself in the incessant search for professional success. He took a long shower, shaved carefully, and put on simple clothes, jeans, a t-shirt, and sneakers, instead of the impeccable suits that had become his second skin. He wanted his exterior to reflect the inner change he was determined to make. He sat down at the kitchen table with a black coffee and a blank notebook. He began to write, not a strategic plan like the ones he was developing for his company, but an honest reflection on who he had been, who he was now, and who he wanted to become. He listed everything he needed to change: his values, his priorities, his definition of success. He recognized that the path would be difficult, that old habits do not transform overnight, that broken trust takes time to be rebuilt. But he was willing to do the necessary work to prove with actions, not just words, that his transformation was genuine. After several hours of deep reflection and planning, Antonio picked up his phone. It was time to take the first concrete step in his journey of redemption. With slightly trembling fingers, he dialed Helena's number. Every ring of the phone seemed like an eternity. Her mind raced frantically, rehearsing what she would say, fearing that she would refuse to answer, or worse, that she would answer only to say that it was too late. Finally, after the fourth ring, he heard the voice he loved so much, the voice he had ignored so many times when she tried to reach him across the abyss he himself had created. "Hello?" Helena's voice sounded cautious, as if she already knew who was calling. "Helena? It's me, Antonio." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion he felt. He took a deep breath and continued. "We need to talk." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, a silence laden with history, with past hurts, with uncertain hopes. "About what, Antonio?" Her voice was not hostile, but kept a protective distance, a wall built to protect a heart that had already been wounded too much. "About everything. About what happened to us. About what I did wrong. About..." He paused, searching for the right words. "About who I want to be from now on." Another silence, longer this time. Antonio could almost visualize Helena on the other side, pondering, assessing the sincerity in her voice, weighing the years of unfulfilled promises against the possibility of true change. "My mother has passed away," he said finally, feeling that he needed to offer something real, something beyond empty promises. "I went to her funeral in Minas. I found a few things that made me see a lot of things differently. I'm sorry for your mother," replied Helena, her voice softening a little. "She was an amazing woman." "Yes, it was. And I wasn't there for her as I should have, just as I wasn't for you and Miguel." Another silence. But this time it was Helena who broke it. "Antonio, I spent years waiting to hear these words. Years waiting for you to realize we were slipping through your fingers as you clung to things that couldn't hold you back." The raw honesty in his words hit Antonio like a punch in the stomach, but he knew he deserved every word. "You're right, and I'm not calling to ask him to come back," he said, surprising himself with his honesty. "I'm calling to ask for forgiveness, for everything, for the time I wasted, for the wrong priorities I set, for being so blind. Forgiveness is not something that is granted with a simple word, Antonio. It's a process. I know, and I am willing to go through this process for as long as it takes. I'm not asking for anything in return, Helena. Just wanted to let you know that I finally got it. Late, I know, but I get it." Helena sighed deeply. When he spoke again, his voice was choked with emotion. "What has changed, Antonio? What happened for you to finally get it?" He then told of his mother's death, of the letter he had found, of the rustic cross he now carried with him. He talked about the epiphany he had had, about how he finally understood what his mother had tried to teach him all his life. "She left a wooden cross for me," he explained, his voice trembling with emotion. "A simple, rustic cross, with no material value whatsoever, but loaded with meaning, a symbol of true love, one who sacrifices, who puts the other first. It seems that your mother has achieved even after leaving what I have tried for years," Helena commented without bitterness, just noting a fact. "She's always had that gift," Antonio agreed with a faint smile. "The gift of seeing beyond appearances, of valuing what really matters." The conversation then flowed more naturally. Helena told about her new life in Campinas, about how she was working as a teacher, the dream she had abandoned when Antonio insisted that she dedicate herself exclusively to her family while he built his career. She talked about Miguel, about how the boy was adapting to the new school, about how he asked for his father every day, despite the hurt he carried. "He misses you, you know? Even with everything that happened, he still idolizes you. It has your photo as wallpaper on the tablet." Those words touched Antonio deeply. His son still loved him, still longed for his presence, despite all the times he had let him down. "I don't know if there's still room for me in your life and Miguel's," she said, her voice trembling. "But I want you to know that regardless of what happens between us, I am determined to change, to be a different man, a man who understands the true value of things." Helena sighed deeply before answering. "Miguel asks for you every day. He even has the photo of the two of you fishing in the lake as wallpaper for the tablet. I think maybe it's time for us to talk in person. A wave of relief and hope swept through Antonio. It was not a promise of reconciliation, but it was a half-open door, an opportunity he did not deserve but was determined to honor. Whenever and wherever you want, he replied, trying to contain the emotion in his voice. They arranged to meet the following weekend in a quiet cafe in Campinas. It would be a meeting between the two of them, without Miguel, a chance to talk honestly, to assess if there was any possibility of reconstruction. When he hung up the phone, Antonio felt a mixture of hope and fear. He didn't know if he could win back his family, but he was determined to try. Not out of obligation, but out of love. The kind of love he was finally beginning to understand. The love symbolized by that rough cross. In the days that followed, Antonio dedicated himself to putting order in his life. The first and most difficult decision was in relation to his career. After a night of deep reflection, he concluded that he could not continue on the same professional path if he really wanted to transform his personal life. The next morning, he called his boss, the CEO of the company where he had worked for more than a decade and where he had built his reputation as a ruthless and efficient executive. "Silva, what a surprise to hear you. When will you come back from leave? We have that negotiation with the Chinese next week and no one knows the project better than you." Antonio took a deep breath before answering, "I'm actually calling to communicate my decision to leave the company, Richard." There was a moment of astonished silence on the other end of the line. "You're kidding, right? Or is it some kind of tactic to ask for a raise? Because if it is, you've picked a bad time." "It's nothing like that. It's a personal decision, which I've been considering for some time." "What the hell happened, Silva? Did you receive a better offer? Is it the competition? Because whatever they offered, we can cover." "I didn't receive any proposal, and it's not about money. Don't tell me it's because of that story with your wife. She left you, didn't she? Look, this passes. We all go through marital crises. Don't throw away a brilliant career because of personal problems." Anthony felt a twinge of irritation at the way his boss trivialized the separation, as if it were just a temporary inconvenience, not the result of years of neglect and wrong choices. "I'm not throwing anything away, Richard. I'm choosing a different path, one that allows me to be there for the people I love." "You're throwing away a brilliant career," insisted the boss, incredulous. "Think about it, Silva. We are about to expand to the international market. You're on the front lines for a promotion." "I've thought it through," replied Antonio, with a serenity he had never felt before. "And I realize that I've been chasing the wrong kind of success. Thank you for the opportunity, but my decision is made. You're going to regret it," Richard warned, his voice now cold. "When the dust settles and you realize what you've thrown away, don't come and ask me to come back." "I'm not going," Antonio assured, "but I am grateful for everything I have learned over the years." As he hung up the phone, he felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he could breathe freely. He wasn't sure what he would do professionally from then on, but he knew it would be something that would allow him to maintain a work-life balance, something that didn't require sacrificing his family on the altar of corporate success. On the morning of his departure for Campinas, Antonio made a last visit to the cemetery where his mother was buried. She took a bouquet of daisies, her favorites, and knelt before the simple tombstone. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered, placing the flowers on the newly covered grave, "for never giving up on myself, even when I gave up on everything that really mattered. I promise that I will honor your legacy. I promise that I will finally understand the meaning of that rude cross." He stood there for nearly an hour, in contemplative silence, as if absorbing the wisdom his mother had tried to impart to him all his life. When he finally got up, he felt empowered, determined to follow the new path he had chosen, no matter what obstacles he encountered. As he drove back to São Paulo, with his mother's wooden cross neatly wrapped in the passenger seat, Antonio realized that he was beginning the most important journey of his life. A journey not toward success as the world defines it, but toward redemption, toward reconciliation, toward the true meaning of a life well lived. The road would be long and certainly full of challenges. Regaining Helena and Miguel's trust would not be easy. Rebuilding your professional life on new foundations would require courage and perseverance. Learning to value what really matters would require constant vigilance against old habits and thought patterns. But for the first time in a long time, Antonio felt genuinely hopeful. The rustic cross he carried with him was more than a reminder of his mother. It was a symbol of the transformation he was determined to accomplish, a constant reminder that true value lies not in material achievement or external recognition, but in the ability to love and serve those God has placed in our path. With this thought in mind, he accelerated slightly, eager to arrive in Sao Paulo and prepare for the meeting with Helena. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined to face it with an open, transformed heart, guided by the most important lesson he had ever learned, the lesson of the rugged cross. Antonio arrived in Sao Paulo on the eve of his meeting with Helena and Miguel. Her luxurious apartment, which once seemed a symbol of her success, now appeared cold and empty, a space without life, without true memories, without love. He placed the rustic cross over the marble fireplace. The contrast between the simplicity of the worn wood and the polished luxury around it was stark. As he watched that symbol, reflecting on everything he had learned and the changes he was determined to make, his cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. With an inexplicable feeling of apprehension, he answered, "Hello, Mr. Silva. This is from the Albert Einstein Hospital. We are calling about Helena and Miguel Silva. There was an accident." Antonio's world, which he had just decided to rebuild, seemed to fall apart again. With his heart racing and his hands trembling, he grabbed his car keys and ran for the door, casting one last glance at the rustic cross. Would this be another test on his way? Or was the universe showing you that sometimes it's too late for redemption? What would Antonio find in the hospital? And how would this new trial test his newfound understanding of the meaning of sacrifice and true love? Antonio arrived in Sao Paulo on the eve of his meeting with Helena and Miguel. Her luxurious apartment, which once seemed a symbol of her success, now appeared cold and empty, a space without life, without true memories, without love. He placed the rustic cross over the marble fireplace. The contrast between the simplicity of the worn wood and the polished luxury around it was stark. As he watched that symbol, his cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello, Mr. Silva. This is from the Albert Einstein Hospital. We are calling about Helena and Miguel Silva. There was an accident." Antonio's world, which he had just decided to rebuild, seemed to fall apart again. With his heart racing and his hands trembling, he grabbed his car keys and ran for the door, casting one last glance at the rustic cross. Would this be another test on his way? Or was the universe showing you that sometimes it's too late for redemption? What would Antonio find in the hospital? And how would this new trial test his newfound understanding of the meaning of sacrifice and true love? Don't miss the continuation of this exciting story in the next video. Find out if Antonio will be able to find true redemption or if fate has other plans for him. The transformation journey has only just begun, and the deepest challenges are yet to come. Click on the link on the final screen to follow the outcome of this inspiring story based on the hymn, Rude Cross.